Welcome, Pirkei Avot. I am Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi, and you have found Beit Virtuali. All right, quick, don't think. Tell me which of these are Jewish ideas of life after death. Oblivion? Neutral life after death, everyone goes to the exact same place regardless of what kind of life they lived. Punishment or reward after death. Heaven or hell as a literal idea. Resurrection of the dead, and then eternal life here on earth, which is its own paradise. Reincarnation. Don't know, don't care. Right, come on, which one? Quick, quick, quick. Yeah? And is it a surprise if I say it's actually all of them? If you're coming at this video from outside of Judaism, it might seem a little bit strange because other religions have what happens after we die as a belief, as a value, as even a dogma. And in Judaism, it's just not that important. I think that if you were to ask a lot of Jews who grew up in a Jewish household, differentiating from people who converted to Judaism, who oftentimes bring ideas with them from the religions or cultures of their birth. But if you were to ask people who are born into Jewish households what they think happens after they die, I think the most common reaction you're going to get is something like, yeah, well, when I think about it, but I don't really think about it, I think that this is what happens. And I know that that's hard to hear if you yourself believe very strongly, because within certain religions, especially Christianity in the Western world, life after death is a value of the religion. And within Judaism, it's just not that big of a deal. It's not a Jewish value, which is one of the reasons this channel exists, to help bring these things to our consciousness. Now, before we move along, I want to spend just a moment on this idea right here, because really none of these videos are going to make sense. And actually, any opposing idea to an idea we already have isn't going to make any sense without understanding that we don't actually listen to people. I know we have the illusion we do. Surprise, surprise. What we do is we listen to ourselves interpreting what they're saying to us. So oftentimes, if someone says, well, I don't really care about what happens after we die, and you yourself believe very strongly that that's an important thing, you're not hearing someone say, I don't care. What you're hearing someone say is, you are of no value, or I don't like you, or you're a bad person. Just think about that for a second. This is part of what's going on in society right now. And one of the reasons that I'm doing several videos on life after death is to just make how we exist a little bit more conscious. So last week in my video, What the Hell?, we tried to deconstruct where the concept of hell came from. And if you haven't watched that video, a lot of what I'm going to say in this video doesn't make a lot of sense. So go ahead and look in the links down below. The first link is going to be the video from last week. So click on that, watch that first. I know it's long. I don't really care. It's interesting. Watch it. But this week, thanks to the absolute bench Jacob, one of actually my very first Patreon, we're going to move from what the hell to why the hell, which is going to fill in some of the gaps that I couldn't get to last week. Now, I'm still not going to get to every single subject I wanted to cover on this because it's not possible, but the things that are most interesting to you, let me know, because either the Rebbitzin and I will cover that in one of our upcoming podcasts, or I'll make that the subject of an upcoming Beit Virtuali online education. Those are starting in October, by the way, with a Kabbalistic theme. But in order to understand the complexity of how it could be that Jews include all of these what seem to be contradictory ideas and how they can all be a part of the Jewish dialogue, we really need to go back and look at how these ideas evolved to begin with. And rather than looking at each of these individual items in the moment that they began to appear in the Jewish collective consciousness, I want to go down and find the moment where everything changed. Now, once again, we've got this idea in Judaism of one Torah, two rabbis, 3 to 17 different opinions. And once again, you're going to have people and religious leaders within Judaism who profoundly disagree with what I'm talking about. Once again, ask the questions. I'll give you the sources. We'll go deeper into it if that's what you wish to do. Now, just to summarize a little bit from last week, Judaism spent a lot of time in its narrative history not caring about what happened after we died. And if that sounds strange, it means you've probably been influenced from later Christian perspectives where life and death and life after death are the most important stuff, and then that's backward projected onto the Torah. But the Torah talks about very practical and literal aspects of life and death. But at some point this changed. Now, I'm going to make a few cases today. One of the cases is that anytime that there's a profound theological shift in any religion, Judaism is no different, there was probably a trauma, some great event that happened that forced us to change our opinion. And the other case that I'm going to make is that Jews being concerned, at least to some degree, with afterlife came from a massive case of cognitive dissonance. You've probably heard that term quite a bit these days because either side of the political aisle is constantly trying to accuse the other side of being inside of a cognitive dissonance. So I think it should probably be required reading if we're using this term to go back and see where this term came from. There's a psychologist named Leon Festinger who wrote a book in 1956 called When Prophecy Fails. Keep that title in mind for a second. Now, in this book, Leon Festinger was following a UFO doomsday cult, and at some point in the 50s, the UFOs were going to come down and destroy the world. And, of course, the date was written, and the cult knew exactly when that was going to happen. And before the event, Leon Festinger actually prophesied himself, if you will. Leon Festinger hypothesized about what would happen when, well, of course, the UFOs didn't come. Last time I checked, they probably didn't come because the world's still here unless we're living in a simulation, and that's not the subject of this video. His hypothesis was that when the event wouldn't happen, that the group who believed so profoundly with every aspect of their being, their mind, that this would happen, that they would then double down. So what happened? Well, one, the UFOs didn't come. Number two, they doubled down. In this case, what they did is not only did they believe more extremely, they believed it was their act of faith in believing so strongly that kept the UFOs from coming to begin with. So in other words, the non-occurrence of the event made them believe more strongly that that actually occurred. Well, how in the world could that ever possibly happen in Judaism? Well, from the same thing, when prophecy fails. I love this term. In Germany, we learned it as gescheiterte Prophezeiung. So not just a failure, but an utter sinking of the ship that carried a prophecy. And when did that happen, right? Because in Judaism, prophecy has to be true. Well, we're going to have to unpack a lot over the next few years in order to get to a full and comprehensive discussion on that, because first of all, we have a misunderstanding of prophecy. Second of all, we have a misunderstanding of true. Those are for different days, for different videos, for different discussions. But here's what happened. In around 586 BCE, yes, I know, you hear someone say a year and you turn off your brain. Just that's one of those years that you should know. 586 BCE, the first temple was destroyed. It was destroyed by the Babylonian Empire, King Nebuchadnezzar, and the Jewish elite, the aristocracy of Jerusalem, was schlepped away to Babylon. We call this the Babylonian diaspora, among other things, and this was coming for a long time. The northern kingdom of Israel had been destroyed by the Assyrian Empire in 722 BCE, and, well, we were actually pretty small, not very politically powerful kingdoms, so to some extent it was inevitable that the bigger swallows the smaller, as much as we don't like to think of such things. But the great prophet that existed at this time, there were several, but the really, really important one for Judaism and for Christianity, and also for Islam, believe it or not, is Jeremiah. Jeremiah was born midway through the 7th century BCE and died about 16 years after the beginning of the Babylonian exile. He's known for the book of Jeremiah and also the book of Lamentations, Echa in Hebrew. And there's a lot of discussion in the book of Jeremiah as he's writing. He was in Jerusalem for a lot of this, writing letters back and forth to the elite who were still living in Babylon. This idea that every single Jew in Jerusalem was schlepped away is complete fiction. It was the attempt of the Babylonians to destroy the ability for Jews to govern themselves and to destroy their kingly structure and their religious structure. So there were still Jews who were living in the area of Jerusalem, and Jeremiah, one of them, kept on sending letters back saying, listen, don't listen to these prophets who are false prophets. Here's what's really going to happen. Here's what's really happening. And one of the most critical of these prophecies, and again, I put that in quotes because the word prophecy, we think of telling the future. It's not what it means in Judaism. Video for your future day. But this incredibly critical statement of truth from the communication that Jeremiah had with his understanding of the greater relationship with the eternal, however we want to look at it, is called the prophecy of the 70 years, something that takes a huge part in Christian belief, but is also pretty important at this time in Jewish belief. And he essentially says that this exile is going to last for 70 years. What he actually says is, magic glasses on, Ki lefi melot levavel shiv'im shana efkod etchem. When Babylonian 70 years are over, I will take note of you. code. I will care for you. But after 70 years. Now, this is in chapter 29, verse 10. There's a couple other places where 70 years is mentioned. Back to magical glasses. Earlier in chapter 25, verses 11 and 12, we have, this whole land shall be a desolate ruin, and those nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And then once again, when the 70 years are over, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation of the land of the Chaldeans for their sin, declares the Eternal. I will make it a desolation for all time. Kind of got it right, but once again, he's not telling the future. This is about something else. And first of all, this trying to fit in historically, it was roughly 70-ish years later that the Jews started returning. And that's also, again, a video for another day to go into a deep dive. But 70 is not meant to be literal. 70 is what we call a typological number. Like 40, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and the wandering was 40 years in the desert, etc., etc. These are typological numbers. 40 always means a long time. 70, well, it's 7, right? The days of creation, the days of the week, the amount of times we go around in a chuppah, etc., etc. 7 means a number of completion, a number of fullness. And in Psalm 90, we hear 70 is the number of the measure of the life of a human being. 80 if they're very, very strong. But that's what 70 means. And we see 70 also appearing over and over again. So it means that after a full lifetime, not a generation, but after a full lifetime, that Babylon will be destroyed and Jerusalem will be restored. Now that happens somewhat, but not completely, because there's a few key verses later on. Back to the magic glasses. In chapter 30, verses 8 and 9, we get to this, V'haya vayom hahu, and it shall come to pass in that day. We're going to talk about that statement in just a little bit. And that day declares the Lord of hosts, Adonai Tzevaot, God who is part of armies. Very ancient idea of gods. I will break the yoke from your neck. The yoke is something that is used over and over again in the Jeremiah prophecies. And will rip off your bonds. Strangers shall no longer make slaves of them. So far, so good. Instead, they shall serve the Eternal, their God. So far, so good. Here's the key. And David, the king, whom I will raise up for them. Magic glasses off. And David, the king that I shall raise up for them. See, there's a problem. We were restored. We rebuilt Jerusalem. We rebuilt the temple a couple times. But there was never a Davidic king. Yes, the lineage of David had continued on for a long time. We have something called the Exilarch in the future, the line of David continuing this kingdom in exile. But even though someone named Zerubbabel, and we sing about him on Ma'oz Tzur for Hanukkah, so a name that's kind of carried down through the ages, even though he was part of the groups of people that came back to restore Jerusalem, a Davidic king never again sat on the throne. But yet, prophecy said that a Davidic king would be part of this restoration. But prophecy's true and complete all the time, right? So what happens? Or what happened? Remember the UFO cult? We doubled down. Just like that, in an instant, completely. We changed our entire idea of how prophecy worked from a statement about the reality of now, the truth of the eternal, to something that's going to happen. Bayom Hahu, in the coming day. So if there was supposed to be a Davidic king on the throne, then there was going to be a Davidic king on the throne. And if it didn't happen when it was supposed to, then it was going to happen at some day in the future. Bayom Hahu. This is a completely familiar story within Christianity. In the first century, in the early Christian narratives, the people who were there in the first half of the first century of the Common Era fully expected Jesus to be there, to come back in their lifetime. And when this didn't happen, then the entire theology of Christianity developed around that there would be a second coming. Oh, and in the story it just gets better, because the prophecies of Jeremiah were meant for an audience that were present in these events, the end of the generations of people who lived in Babylon and who would return to Jerusalem with the Davidic king. Well, if they were supposed to be there for the return of a Davidic king, and they weren't, then that meant that in some way they still must be, opening up a complete new doorway for new thoughts. And there are three implications that come from this, all of which completely changed Judaism, hugely influenced Christianity as well as Islam. The first implication is resurrection of the dead, mechei hametim. If I can't be present for it because it didn't happen now,
then my body will come back at some future idealized time to see the prophecy fulfilled. Second implication, or the immortality of the soul. If I can't be physically present for the fulfillment of prophecy, then the part of me that never dies, some part of me must carry on to experience that in some idealized or some physical, real way. And finally, a word that I haven't introduced yet today, but I've been playing around, the eschaton. Eschaton means the end times. It manifests very differently in Judaism than it did in Christianity, but the idea of in the coming days, Bayom Hahu, in the days of the Lord, Yom Hashem, in the days of the Messiah, the coming Davidic king, Yom HaMashiach, in the coming world, Ha'olam Haba. If the soul doesn't die, or we carry on in some way, then all the options I presented at the beginning of this video become open. Oblivion was already there, but that we can be reincarnated, you can see how that fits into this, that our soul could go to a place of punishment or to reward, or that there could be a holding place that includes paradise or hell. And just as a teaser, this is where in the following hundreds of years, we start getting quotes like that from Pirkei Avot that says that even though a righteous person might suffer in this life, surely they will be rewarded in a coming life. Or we can get to Maimonides' discussions about punishment and reward after death in the Laws of Repentance in the Mishnah Torah, where he discusses how long does a soul have to be punished after it's died before it can go to some other better place. And then the fullness of Kabbalah under Isaac Luria, we get to an entire literature called the Gilgulei Hanshemot, the Wheels of the Soul, where Kabbalists go back in time and look at different figures of Jewish history to see who died and who became whom as our soul was born into new bodies in order to fulfill our requirements of healing the world. And I'm going to end it there. What's critical to take away from this is that there was a point. Yes, it took hundreds of years to unfold, but there was a point where we went from believing that what we do in this life is all that really matters to what comes next either is all important or very important. And that's going to be my question for you in the comments down below. Discussion. Did we lose or did we gain? And why? What's the better existence? To be worried only about now, or is there a value in belief in a coming world, a coming reality and end times, however that manifests? That's it. Thank you once again for joining our growing family. If you wish to support our channel, please be a Patreon. Join down below. We've got the links there for you. I'll put as well down below links for other videos that relate to this one, links to the various biblical verses so you can look at the Hebrew and various English translations or other translations. And as always, if you're not able to financially support us, then it makes every bit of difference in the world to subscribe to this channel, like this video, turn on notifications, discuss with me, with us in this community, the question that I posed down below. And then as we go about our days, spend a little bit of time today lifting someone else up. In the process of doing that, we lift each other up. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.
בית ישראל, עמך אהבת. תורה ומצוות, חוקים, משפטים אותנו לימדת. תורה ומצוות, חוקים